Today, my guest is Sean Knox, and Sean is a client of mine. He works for a company up in New Hampshire, and you've probably heard me with these guys before, HireAlliance. The two managing partners at HireAlliance have done these shows with me before. Jay Brunetti's done a few, Dave Kamel, and Sean is one of their recruiters. He's technically titled a staffing consultant over there. And I asked him to do this podcast with me primarily because he's a millennial and he's succeeding. And I wanted to create a conversation where he might be able to share a little bit about his story, about what he's gone through to find his way as a younger salesperson in the staffing industry. And my hope is that his story actually resonates with people even outside of the staffing industry. So Sean, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I called you. This was not your idea.
Yep.
I thought it would be helpful to have this conversation. You and I met just about a year and a half ago, a few months after you took this job. So you had a little bit of experience in the industry, but prior to that, you had no experience in this space. So just tell everybody, you graduated from Keene State, and then what happened?
Yeah, so I graduated with a degree in political science and American history. And I had a job with one of the current senators as I graduated college, working in the district office, answering phones, going through mail. It's always been an interest of mine. And from there, I got into different campaigns, specifically that Senate campaign back in 2016. And, it was a lot of talking to people, getting volunteers together, all the kind of grunt work that you get at the lower level. And that went on for a couple of years. I did that at the federal level, the state level, with different races in Massachusetts. And then something clicked in my head towards the end of 2017 that I'm doing all of this work, putting in 16, 18 hours a day. Why the hell am I not doing something that I can do that and make more money? So that's really what got me into staffing, because I had a friend who worked for another company in New Hampshire that always raved about it. So I started looking at some different companies, and that's how I got into it towards the end of 2017.
Okay. And you spent a year and change with a company before you took this job. And, for those that don't understand staffing or don't know a lot about staffing, I've spent my whole life in the space and then training companies in the space. So it's very familiar to me. But I would say for those that aren't in the space, think of it as if you're in a role that requires you to sell or learn how to sell. I mean, that's what you have to do. You've got to do that every day, all day, basically, right? You're a sales guy, Sean, for the most part.
Yeah, I think that's what it boils down to.
Okay. So I wanted to frame this up because, most of the organizations that I've encountered over the years really have a hard time getting new hires up to speed. And the millennial generation, whether you like it or not, I know you are one, it's been stereotyped for all intents and purposes. And maybe unfairly so, because I've worked with some pretty successful millennials, but there are labels attached to your generation. I'm sure you're familiar with some of those. And but I wanted to talk to you because you have always demonstrated to me a curiosity and a level of resilience that, quite frankly, I think is required to be successful if you're going to get into a sales role of any kind. I'm curious about your story because of this. You joined without a ton of experience in the space. You joined right before the pandemic hit, like at the worst time. And the thing that's so interesting to me is that you're doing really, really well right now. And you somehow found your way during a time that most people were kind of like checking out, especially without experience. So I'm interested to know why that is, what your story is, how you did it, what worked, what didn't, that whole thing. So I guess my first question is, how did you get started? How did you stay focused?
And you're talking about at HireAlliance specifically, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I got started over here. So I had been at another staffing company working with medical professionals for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And in those 2 years, you're obviously at the start of that going to experience a lot of ups, a lot of downs, and question yourself a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I actually got over to HireAlliance by speaking to someone I knew from college that, recommended that I might be a good fit for this company. And one of the things I realized when I came over here that it's one of those things you don't know what you don't know, but this job becomes a lot easier when you believe in what you do. So having been in staffing for a couple of years and knowing how certain things can feel, this was just intriguing for me to get over here because I could kind of story tell my experience as I was talking to different people in the industry. And that's really how it got my start and my draw to this company. But there's obviously a big learning curve because talking with doctors about the different procedures they can do on their hearts is a lot different than talking to recruiters and salespeople about the X's and O's of their commission plans.
Right. So for those that don't know what you do each day, you're basically responsible for calling people, most of whom maybe you don't know right away, trying to engage them as a resource to help them navigate the future of their career. So your job is to constantly build relationships and never stop doing it.
Yeah. I mean, at its essence, that's what it is. And that's what all sales really is, if you boil it down to it. But we're in a unique spot because we're doing the same job that our target audience is doing every day. And there's not a lot of resources out there like that.
Right. Well, what about like that first, so I've been around a little bit longer than you, but the whole idea of picking up the phone and calling people that don't know you, who might not want to take your call, has been, a bone of contention for salespeople forever. And one of the labels attached to folks in your age bracket is they don't pick up the phone. They don't use the phone. They don't want to talk to people. They don't want face-to-face. And maybe that's an unfair label, but that's what you're required to do each day. How do you keep yourself going, willing to do this, even though maybe some of the people you're talking to don't want to talk to you?
I think what it boils down to is having a, genuine curiosity in people and wanting to meet new people. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to pick up the phone. Right. But I mean, part of this too is, I think what I do and the other people I work with at HireAlliance do is very valuable. And even if people don't want to talk to me, I still feel like they need to hear what I have to say because I think it's so important. So I don't want to ever not pick up the phone because this person said no to me. I'll pick up the phone again and say, you may not want to hear this, but what do you want to hear if I'm going to call you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What keeps you going though? When you think about, you mentioned HireAlliance, obviously I've known HireAlliance for years. I love those guys. I love the culture they've built. And I've met so many people who have worked there over the years, yourself included. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting how much of a family it is up there. But if you didn't necessarily feel the connection to the company, I'm wondering if you would be as willing to make those calls. How much does the dynamic at the company and the relationships that you have with your management team and your peers, how much does that impact your desire to pick up the phone and tell the story?
I mean, I think that's one of the biggest pieces of it, right? Because it comes back down to that belief, but everything truly, and this is kind of a cliche you hear at companies, but we really are a family here. Oftentimes I find myself on the phone with coworkers, not talking about work-related things for, sometimes 40 minutes at a time just to, hear what's going on. But I think that does play a big piece in why I want to pick up the phone because, Dave and Jay and everyone else here invest so much time into everyone else that you want to do well for them. You want to, in addition to yourself, but you want to, get a good showing out there.
Right. And I would imagine at times, not naming any names, that you may find yourself in a position where you're trying to help somebody find a job and you can't always guarantee that the company that you're sharing with them is going to treat their people the same way that maybe you're treated.
Right. Yeah.
So that's got to be kind of, that's a tougher dynamic. And I think a lot of the people I would imagine that you approach that are actually looking for new work might not feel that connection with their existing company. So there's that balance between helping people, move on and hopefully find something that causes them to want to stay. So again, beyond your control, but how often are you in those conversations with people?
Oh, every day. I mean, a lot of times it's people don't even realize that's the connection that they have to make for their company. They're approaching their job search as in, look at these 5 different job descriptions, what fits best. But specifically in sales, that's not what is going to keep you around. It's going to be the investment from the company, the relationships you have there, and all the things that you may not realize front of mind that's important to you, but it is what makes you tick when you're at these jobs. Because no one, I mean, I don't want to say no one's going to be excited to make phone calls, but I can't picture many people that grew up being like, hey, I want to grow up to be a salesperson, make 100 calls a day and, sell this service or this product. It's really what goes on behind the scenes that keeps you going.
One of the things you said to me was success doesn't come quickly, especially in your world as a salesperson. So therefore, I would imagine that a lot of the work you do early on, there's no immediate payoff. There's no money coming right away, and you could be doing a ton of work for nothing. How do you maintain the belief that what you're doing is actually going to pan out?
It's just through repeating the process. I mean, just the way I go about talking to people. I wouldn't be successful if I called, 10 people a day being like, hey, here are these 10 open jobs. You have the great background. You should talk to them. The way I like to talk to people is really learning these things that make them tick, and not just be the recruiter that's going to throw jobs, because they're just going to forget about me after that first call. What keeps me going and motivating here is those calls I get 6 months later, 8 months later, being like, hey, I remember you said this when we had this first conversation. I'm very interested to kind of hear your take on this now and what we're seeing. So the people that, remember the value you provided them on the front end, instead of just trying to tick a box and fill a job and forget about them. That's really what keeps it going for me.
Did you know that early though? I mean, you're learning that now, like as people you called maybe last fall are calling you now. But when you first took the job, over the first few months of just grinding away, did you know that initial effort was going to pay off 3 months later, 6 months later?
I didn't know it because I hadn't seen it. So you always have questions about it, but I knew this is what I had to do because it's been successful for other people. So it's tough to know that it's going to work until it does, but then just it clicks when it actually happens.
Right. Well, how did you stay focused during a time when a lot of people weren't focused? I'm sure you were just as impacted by the pandemic and life's challenges as anybody else. How did you keep your head down throughout it and not, not give up or not take the path of least resistance, as you've said to me in the past?
Yeah, I think a lot of that can be attributed to my mindset, not only about work, but really anything in life. And one of the biggest things that I've always prided myself on is that once I take an interest in something, I don't want to just be decent at it. I want to be an expert and known as an expert. And that doesn't mean necessarily like getting emails like, hey, you're doing an awesome job, but like I have those conversations with someone and they're like, he really knows his stuff. I need to stay in touch with this guy. Or even if it's something like, hey, Sean knows his stuff about fantasy football, I'm going to ask him this advice. It's really anything in life.
Right.
And to keep me going throughout the pandemic, I realized that the economy that we were working in now and how companies were viewing their job searches, their staffing needs, it was flipped on its head from where it was back in 2019. So I couldn't just keep doing things the same way. I had to really kind of think outside the box and how I approach different situations. And that kind of stuff kept me going because I did find success doing things in a different way and really growing my skill set throughout a time when a lot of people weren't hiring, and having success showed me that there's no reason I can't do it when things are better.
Right. Did you ever doubt yourself though?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had a lot of things happen outside of work, family type things that anyone who's gone through that kind of stuff, it's really hard to ignore and take that out of the workplace. But the biggest thing for me there was, instead of focusing on the 20 reasons why I can't, why I shouldn't do something, those are really easy to think of. I just tried to narrow my focus on, here's why I can, here's what I'm going to do. And I know that sounds kind of, like a cliche saying that, but shifting that mindset really helped me from like doing all right to doing very well at this job.
Right. Do you find that when you're recruiting people for your clients, or you're talking to your clients about what they want in their next hire, do you find that everybody kind of gets what is required? Like, as you're talking to a candidate, for example, about taking a job, or the idea or the possibility of exploring a job, do you find that resilience in the people you're talking to, or are you finding that, wow, it's tough to find that commitment? It's tough to find people that are willing to put in the work, or is it easy? I mean, do you know what I'm asking here? I mean, you've got a quality in you that during a tough time, you still kept your head down and you didn't give up. Are you finding that in the people you're recruiting, or are you finding people that are more apt to give up and take the path of least resistance?
I think you get a lot of both. I mean, I think my experience with this makes it kind of easier to sniff that out because I can ask questions in that way. But it's tough to say whether you find one or the other. But yeah, that's a tough question, because I mean, obviously I'm going to continue working more with the people who have that mindset as opposed to the other, but you do see a lot of both.
Mm-hmm. What concerns you, when you're recruiting people? Are there any qualities in a person that would cause you to think this is not a placeable individual?
There's a lot. So I'm trying to think a couple I could talk about here. I think one would be, someone talking about, a company not doing this for me, or this person gets this, I don't get this. And kind of just, if someone seems to be making excuses, obviously there are valid situations that you can kind of poke and prod and figure out. But generally speaking, the people making excuses are just trying to look for others to blame than taking a look inside themselves and being like, all right, what can I change?
Yep. So I think I mentioned I started a CEO group. Somebody very well is actually in the group. So the topic yesterday was all about hiring people. And there were all different kinds of companies in the meeting, and they all have the same issue. It's, how do we find good people? Where do we get them? And it's just as much of a mystery, even at C-level, on how do I tap in? Like, what advice would you give to a company that needs to hire anybody? What are companies not doing that they should be doing? If you could just say, here's one piece of advice for all you companies out there, this is what you should be doing.
I think a big piece of advice, I'm taking this from my own personal experience, is having an environment where you can be very open to talk about struggles, whether it's inside or outside of work, and also some patience on both the prospective employee that you're hiring and the employer's end. Because you see it a lot, and I think we touched on it quick before, but either employees giving up on an employer too quickly without covering all their bases, or vice versa. It happens all the time. So
cover both of those then. If you think about employees that give up on the company they work for, obviously you're incentivized to help somebody leave an organization because you'll get paid if you put them somewhere else. So that aside, there are times when it makes sense for them to leave, not just so you can get paid, but there are people that should leave. And then there are other times where they should stay. When is it too early? Are there what might be unintentionally causing an employee to give up on the company they're working for? And maybe the company doesn't even know it, but the person's like, I'm out of here. What causes that to happen?
I think one of the biggest things that causes it to happen is that lack of communication. I mean, there have been a lot of calls that I've been on where people are like, all right, tell me about all the jobs you have. And I have to back it up a minute, figure out why they're even looking in the first place. More often than not on those calls, it ends in a suggestion to be like, before you do this, you should have this conversation with your boss, because he may not even know you're feeling this way. And if you haven't talked about it, your issues could be resolved and not have to go somewhere else. You could be in the same spot and just have a better understanding with your employer and yourself.
That's excellent advice. I'm sure they don't hear that from anybody else. What about?
I mean, everyone's trying to make a quick fee, but that's what I pride myself on. Is it comes back to being that expert. Like, sometimes the best advice isn't to tell someone to leave because their situation may not get better. Their best situation could be where they are, but having a couple conversations to change things.
What about on the company side? There are many companies that fall in love early and hire people. And then they're out of love with those people in about a month or two. This isn't the person I thought I was hiring.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? And I've had this happen with clients over the years where they've mentally given up on somebody who ultimately turned into like their top person because they had the patience to hang on. But how do you help or coach a company to be patient, to not to get, like, under what circumstances should the company, bide their time, wait, give the person a little more rope here? What advice would you give to a company that makes too quick a decision on somebody and doesn't give them a chance?
I mean, my advice would be that the person running this company should know that nothing comes quick in staffing. So I feel bad saying this again, but it would come down to that communication. Is there an issue that's not being addressed? Is there, something greater that you can't overcome? Or what tools do you need to be successful, moving forward? Because it's, you see it a lot at some of these bigger staffing companies specifically, where people's production is, basically a number that's thrown into an algorithm. And then if that number's red, they're going to be watched and put on a performance plan. If it's green, they're good. They're not thinking about the person. So I think it comes back to that communication.
Going back to you, and if you had to give advice to anybody that's doing your job or anybody that's in sales for the first time that has to interact with people that they don't know by phone, by Zoom, maybe face-to-face, what advice would you give to anybody early on in their career to make sure that they actually get up to speed and succeed in a reasonable period of time? What are the things that they must do?
So things they must do, I think, number one, don't overthink what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, sales, recruiting, whatever it is about making connections and being personable with someone. No one's going to want to talk to the recruiter that's their script. And, when they say X, we say Y. When they go A, we go B. It's just learning about a person. So don't overthink the conversations you're having. And then the second biggest thing for me, and I will preach this until the day I retire, die, whatever it is focus on the positive thoughts that you have rather than all these negatives, like I talked about earlier. There's a million reasons and excuses why you can't do something. But if you just focus on those, that's always going to be the thought that comes in your head. Why am I making this call? It's not going to lead to anything. But if you shift that from here's why I'm making this call, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing, the conviction and value comes across a lot more in the conversation when you think that way.
Good advice. And for those that are trapped by technology, and by that I mean, and by the way, I use technology, but where everything's a text message, everything's an email, and you don't have that face to face. How do you find the time when many people don't? How do you actually get live with people when so many of the folks in your industry are finding reasons not to? How do you do that?
It's interesting because I do agree there's a lot more, people that want to text, a lot more people that want to email. And I mean, specifically for me, I could call 4 of my friends right now that would tell them this is probably the 5th time I've called them in the 3 work days this week because I'm always trying to get on the phone. But from talking specifically with what I do in the recruiting industry, people will understand how important a conversation is because that's what they need to do with their candidates too. So a lot of times just reminding them like, hey, we're doing the same thing. There's no way that I can figure all this out over a text message or email. We got to get to know each other on a personal level.
So if I just let you wrap this up, I have 2 questions. 1, is there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to say? And 2, how do you want your future clients and future candidates, what do you want them to think about when they think of you? So it's 2 questions. How would you answer those?
Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't have anything there that wanted you to ask that you didn't, but when it comes to future clients and candidates, I don't want them to think of me as like, this is the guy that's going to get me a new job, or this is the guy that's going to find me my next hire. I want them to think of me as the guy when I have a question that I have no idea about, what others are doing in the industry or what this looks like. He's going to give me accurate information and I can trust him with that. That's what I want.
Okay. All right, Sean. Well, look, I love the conversation. I'm very impressed with what you've been able to accomplish this year. You're doing what many veterans haven't figured out how to do in the industry. I know you've put a bunch of people to work this year, and just keep doing what you're doing, man. It's really cool to see.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Dave.
All right, you're welcome. I'll talk to you soon.